if there was one memory that I could say of my friend Margaret, well, actually, there's not one. There's just so many. I can't sort of go into that. And I'm not sure that it would be very efficient way to start a meeting. But I could say that Margaret has been certainly one of my most incredible friends through the last 25 years or so that we've known each other. She's been my cheerleader. She's been, you know, my go-to person when I have questions, when I want to feel inspired, when I need a problem to solve, and when I need problem, not in personal life, but also in professional life. She's a wealth of knowledge, but wisdom. And I'm really, really happy and excited that you will get to meet her in this hour, in the next hour. So Marg, I'm so happy to have you here, and thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me, Marjorie. It's lovely to be able to have this chat with you.
Yes. So like everybody else, we start with the beginning. And so I would like you to tell us, what was that beginning for you, and how did you end up sort of working in the field of parents and parenting with intellectual disability?
Okay, so my journey and experience with families where parents have intellectual disability goes right back to the mid-1980s. And it was at a time in Australia where we had deinstitutionalisation, where people were, where the trend was for people with intellectual disability to be living in the community. And I was working in the inner city of Sydney, doing community welfare work and as a nurse. And we had a number of people who had been in either state care who were being referred to us in terms of supporting them to live in the community. And most of them were living in pretty rundown boarding houses in the inner city of Sydney. There were two groups of people that introduced me to really the issue of reproductive justice for women with intellectual disability. And they were older women who spoke about how they ended up in institutional care. And it often was because they were seen as naughty teenagers being that they showed an interest in boys. And they talked about having operations and how after the operation they stayed in the institution. And what I came to realise that they were the products of systematic sterilisation of women with intellectual disability. The other group of women that I met were women who had been out of home care. And for those with intellectual disabilities, they never went to foster homes. They grew up in institutional care, in group homes. And those younger ones, they aspired to be parents, and a number of them did become parents. And in journeying with them through pregnancy, I then was confronted by what happened after pregnancy, which was the removal of their babies. And there was one case that particularly stood out to me in terms of the injustice of the situation. And it was a woman by the name of Agnes, and she had two children, and in fact her first daughter was about 7 years old, and they were a team, and she had managed to rear her daughter quite well up until that point. She got involved in a new relationship and had and that relationship was with a person who had some pretty significant trauma from being in a war zone and in East Africa, and so he had his own mental health problems, and they had a child, and when that child was born, it really unhinged both him and her, and both children ended up going into care. And I remember being with at the court when final orders were being made, when it was decided that the child would, her children would stay in permanent care. And the judge was handing down his verdict in the afternoon, and at lunchtime everyone went off to lunch. And I remember saying to Agnes, "Are you going for lunch?" She goes, "No, I've gone, and I only had money for bread and milk." And then she showed me her paper bag. She had her shopping bag with the bread and milk in. She said, "I bought those because I'll need those for my daughter to make her lunch tomorrow for school when she comes home." And we went into court, and the verdict was handed down that the children were to stay in care until the age of 18. And as she walked out of the courtroom, milk just was dripping from her shopping bag, drop by drop by drop on the stone floor. And she walked up to the child protection workers and the lawyers who'd already gathered outside and were encircled. And she walked into the circle and she said to them, she said, "So when am I getting my children back?" And the child protection worker looked over to the lawyers and said, "See, that's how retarded she is." And then said to her, "Agnes, look, you're dripping milk everywhere." And the harshness of that response had a visceral reaction in me and made me aware of the injustice that was there. I wasn't surprised by the magistrate's, the judge's verdict on the children going into care, but I thought, it doesn't have to be this cruel. It really doesn't have to be this cruel. There must be a better way. And I think that that's what spurred my, really consolidated my interest in parents with intellectual disabilities. And then one thing led to another, and I was finishing my social work degree in the mid-90s. And by that stage, I was working with a lot of mums with intellectual disabilities, plus I had become a temporary foster carer for some children of a mum with intellectual disabilities. And I did my final placement in the PIC organisation for family support services, for the family support services in New South Wales or in Australia, you know, doing in-home support for families in vulnerable context. And in that placement, I was doing a research project on how could we actually provide services to families that have more complex needs than what generic services could provide. And I was looking at how we could do individual support packaging around families that had more complex needs. And at the time also, in our state of New South Wales, we had our first Disability Services Act, which, you know, said that mainstream services were to make themselves accessible to people with disabilities. So family support services were wanting to make themselves accessible to what they were seeing was a growing number of mums and dads with intellectual disabilities who were coming known to their services. And as part of that, the PEAK organisation brought out Sandy Timchuk, and I think most of us would say he's sort of, you know, one of the fathers of advocacy for parents with families and parents with intellectual disabilities. And so Sandy came to Australia, and I remember very well going to the couple of days that he was giving training to family support workers and listening to what he had to say. And what really struck me was, this is not about the intellectual disability. This is about the social disablement that happens with having an intellectual disability. And I think that sort of really then made me aware of the issue of parenting with intellectual disability as a social justice issue. That it was really about, it was about how we support and how we resource families where parents have intellectual disabilities. And yeah, so I think they're sort of probably, you know, sort of some of the sort of the strong underpinnings of what has been now nearly a 40-year I want to say crusade or advocacy program on my part, both at a personal, professional and academic level, around trying to effect justice for parents with intellectual disabilities and their children. Only recently, in the last few weeks, I was in court again, and ironically, I was in the same situation where it was a lunch break and the parents were outside. It was a very wet and rainy day, and where the court is a long way away from any fast food takeouts, and the main takeout places are there for the lawyers and the professionals, so they're a little bit more expensive. And it was raining quite heavily outside, and the parents were still sitting inside, and everyone was going off to lunch. And I said to them, I said, "Are you coming for lunch?" And they said, "Oh no, it's off pension week. We've only got enough money, for our fares to get to court." And I said, "So you're not having anything to eat?" They go, "No, we can't afford it here." And I thought to myself, I was taken back to Agnes and her bread and her milk. And I thought to myself, why is it that things are so slow to change? And yeah, so I think in terms of the other part of your question, Marjorie, about, what's the future here? I suppose in one sense you can say, I've seen over decades where I haven't sort of see the same thing happening. But I think it comes back to the same issue of our lack of awareness, our lack of recognition of persons with intellectual disabilities as persons, and as people with feelings, and with people with aspirations, and as sexual beings, and our unwillingness to countenance that and to support that. I think, recently I've also been just finishing off a chapter at the moment. It's not one of the articles that I've given you, but it relates to that, and just, the idea of, going back and looking at the history of eugenics. And when you sort of look at the people that the eugenicists were most concerned about, were people who they described as the underclasses of society. So eugenicism really had a moral overtone, and the feeble-minded that they talked about, sort of in the 1920s, and the famous court case of Buck versus Bell, where Justice Wendell said 3 decades of imbeciles is enough. I think I think that remains today, that there is an element of this is of control of those that are excluded from society, and so I think this seeing of this issue as a justice issue for me is the way that we need to look at it, not about fixing these families up, but about fixing ourselves up as a society in how we treat our most vulnerable, how we, how much we're willing to give a leg up and support to people, how much we're willing to do that. And when it comes to parents with intellectual disabilities, there's little appetite to make resources available to them. And I think, that one of the articles that I gave you was one that some research that I'm doing at the moment with colleagues here at Sydney University, Nikki Wedgwood, Gabe Hindmarsh and Susan Collings. And what we're looking at is in Australia, we've in the last nearly the last decade, we've been rolling out a disability program called the National Disability Insurance Scheme. It's known as the NDIS, and it's quite a significant policy reform here in Australia, and it's about being able to provide individualised support package planning and packages to persons with disabilities to achieve their life goals. But within that, you know, parenting is not seen as a life goal. That's seen as anything to do with parenting is seen, well, that's to do with parenting, that's not to do with your disability. And, you know, and so once again, you know, it's the resources to be able to reach sort of this life goal is denied to this group. And I think, you know, until we address why we're so reluctant to resource these families, we're going to continue to, you know, we continue to see, you know, the attitudes of those that was, you know, encircled outside the court when Agnes in 1987 came out and said, you know, when am I getting my kids back? We'll still see the attitudes of that in terms of why would you even say that? What's the point? What's the point in putting in support?
Yeah, you certainly like, you know, in just like a few minutes already took us, you know, whirlwind and through history in a way. It's quite amazing that you were, you know, before you were even a scholar, you were a person. You were a person who was seeing other people and you recognized them and offered them respect like you would, you know, expect respect as well for you. And I think that that's incredibly what I'm going to say, but it's sort of like incredible the fact that you know, see them as people, as parents, as, you know, families, and that has shaped your career, but also sort of your life. So I just want to unpack a couple of things in what you said. The first thing is that you started when, you know, it wasn't very popular, very known. It was hush hush. We weren't talking about parenting by persons with intellectual disabilities. And you were there to be their support workers. And I think that that has shaped, you know, how your career later on has gone. And what is really interesting to me is how, you know, out of the 3 articles that you selected for today, you didn't, for example, talk about the first one I read about you, or not about you, but from you, which was on assessment. Yet, you know, a lot of the tasks or a lot of the things that you do in your life is to either do the assessments yourself. And when I say assessment, I'm talking about parenting capacity assessments, or you're there to sort of shed a light on what is wrong from those assessments that that are being conducted for court and presented in court. So before we go on, would you like to talk a little bit about sort of assessment and what that means to you, and what to you it should look like, basically?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I my doctoral research was on how we assess the support needs of parents with intellectual disabilities, and you know, quite interestingly, when I was invited by Gwyneth Llewellyn, another one of the founding researchers in this area, and and leading researchers still in this area to develop this assessment tool. It's something that sat very uncomfortably with me. This idea that we can somehow measure up people, ironically, not ironically, but very appropriately, perhaps. And in fact, my iPhone for this podcast is being propped up by my PhD. And the title of my PhD was Beyond Measure, Assessing the Support Needs of Parents with Intellectual Disability. I think the idea of that we can measure something that isn't measurable. So yeah, I've really spent a lot of time thinking about parenting capacity and parenting capacity assessments, mainly because I've been asked to do them. I've come to the point I actually don't believe there's such a thing as parenting capacity that can, I don't think parenting capacity is a construct that is very helpful. I think it's a very individualized way of thinking about parenting. I think that it's poorly understood. I'm doing some research at the moment where we're looking at access and equity for parents with intellectual disabilities in the Children's Court here in New South Wales with my colleague, Susan Collings. And, you know, one of the things that is really clear is, while we talk about this thing called parenting capacity, it's very poorly operationalised. People have different views about what it is. You know, is it about being able to do the tasks of parenting? Is it about, you know, attachment? Is it about decision making? What is it? Like, what is this thing called parenting capacity? And because it's poorly defined and even more poorly operationalized in terms of assessing it, it depends very much on your assessor in terms of what they think is important. But what I found in terms of all the years that I've worked with parents with intellectual disabilities is, you know, the question is not, their capacity is very much tied to the support that they receive. And so my thing is, you know, the question that we should be asking is not about their capacity, or that's not the thing that we should be trying to assess. But what we should be trying to assess is, can this family be supported? Can they be supported? What is it that they need? And if that support can't be provided, why can't it be provided? What's getting in the way of it being provided? And so for me, yeah, I think we need to change how we actually think about assessment of parents in general, really, but you know, I suppose my focus is parents with intellectual disability, because I think for parents with intellectual disability, the linchpin, the thing that makes or breaks them as a family being able to stay together, is the resources that they have at their disposal and how they can utilise those. And when those resources are not made available, that's when they become unstuck. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so I think our question should really be this question of, can parents be supported? Now, interestingly, in terms of my PhD, that's what then led me to the idea of, well, then how do we assess support needs? And what became really clear to me in my research was that working out what's needed has to be a collaborative effort. That it needs to be something that we talk a lot today about co-design, but we need to go on a journey with parents in terms of understanding what the support is that they need, and they need to come on that journey with us. It's a journey that we do together. And so I think for me, it's really about how do you how do you discern what support's going to work for this particular family with this particular child in this particular context? And the way that you discern that is in a collaborative way with the parents. So it's about being able to walk parents through that and walk through with parents to make decisions. And that's where sort of, that was the end product then of my research, was to develop the Understanding and Planning Support Guide, which was really it's really about supported decision making. And what I found quite amazing when we piloted that program, and recently it's been piloted, translated and used in Sweden. And the thing that, you know, that I found sort of most exciting in that was, once parents knew what they needed, how motivated they were to follow through, and the change that you saw. And, you know, it's not rocket science, you know, it was just, once people actually feel that they're listened to, that there's something, yeah, this is going to work for me, they will embrace it. So I think oftentimes, you know, we impose stuff onto parents with intellectual disabilities. We expect them to see it as relevant as we see it as relevant, without sort of spending that time really having those good conversations. I think we're too quick to want to fix families up, and that's part of that is, you know, sort of our neoliberal funding arrangements, which say, you know, we'll put resources in for, you know, a short period of time, but then if you can't stand on your own 2 feet, well, then we're not going to support you any longer. Well, you know, that's just unrealistic, and you know, it's just, it sets people up to fail.
Yeah, it's unrealistic, and I would say even unfair, because, you know, like,
It's unjust. It's unjust.
Yeah.
It's,
You know, like,
you know,
someone who's paraplegic will always require a wheelchair or some kind of, you know, tool that will make them walk. And so, you know, it's the same, but it's sort of like, you know, because they have an intellectual disability and that becomes a state, and it's, you know, something that people perceive as not getting better, right? Probably getting even worse. And so it's a little scary, or I don't know what's going on, but there's definitely a lot of that in terms of miscomprehension, in terms of, you know, just the fact, I think that sometimes it's also sort of um, making, you know, realizing that they're persons first, you know, like, it's not a label that really defines, and your needs, you know, really depends on a whole bunch of different factors, including, you know, how your childhood went, including about your, you know, the support that you mentioned, um, including the environment you live with. So and so there's like so many different factors, but it's sort of like we infantilize them or see them as infants, children, but also sort of only that, when they are so much more, just like we are all so much more than whatever, you know, could define us. You know, there's more than one way of defining each of us.
I think, you know, we've talked about this, Marjorie, you know, what is it about parents with intellectual disabilities that, you know, in terms of parents with disabilities, but what is it particularly about parents with intellectual disabilities? And, you know, recently I was involved in a podcast series here in Australia that's probably available online. It's called We've Got This. Eliza Hull was the producer of that, and I worked with her on that that series. And going back and listening to that series, and subsequently she's put out a book, and looking at the different stories, it's really interesting that of all the parents with disabilities, they all sort of have this thing of people doubt their ability. But for parents with intellectual disability, it's not only doubting their ability, but seeing them as a danger to their children, that they would actually, that they're actually dangerous to be around children. And, you know, that comes back to, I think, that eugenic stuff. of, you know, that they're going to, that parents who are feeble-minded are going to somehow screw up their kids. They're going to, that's what's going to happen to them. And I think some of all of this comes back. So I think that's really sort of something that sets parents with intellectual disabilities or cognitive disabilities apart from say yourself, Marjorie, as a parent with a physical disability, is people might wonder how physically you're going to do the things that you need to do for your child, but they're not going to be concerned about your ability to hand on wisdom to your child or to help with homework or to do those things. Yet they have that about parents with intellectual disabilities. So there's this thing of having to rescue these kids. And I think it's got something to do with, as a society, and maybe it's just about who we are as human beings, as social beings, how much we are able to relate to each other. We relate to each other cognitively, how we relate to each other, our interpersonal communication. And when we can't cognitively connect with a person, then we see them as other. We see them as unusual. We see them as something foreign to us. We see it with people with language even, where we'll see people who, for example, if you look at sort of enforced migration, you know, people are much more willing to accept, for example, at the moment, you know, sort of Ukrainian refugees who can speak English and who look like us, as opposed to Somalian refugees or Afghan refugees who are different from us. They look different from us. They sound different from us. They don't talk like us. And I think there's an element of that with persons with intellectual disabilities or cognitive disabilities, including, you know, being neurodiverse. I think we see it with also mental health, is that where we can't connect with the person cognitively, we other them much more. And so I think some of this has got to do with our own comfort with cognitive difference and diversity, and our lack as a ableist society in being able to accept and I suppose our proficiency in being able to communicate across those diversities. And I think that's where we become unstuck. I think also there's this element that we forget why people are on the outer. We forget why people, you know, we don't see the many ways in which we are given a leg up in life. We don't see why we're more resilient. You know, we don't see that, you know, we've been given many different life chances. You know, we just see that as that person's fault, whereas, you know, we don't actually realise our own privilege. And that comes back to what you were saying, I think, about my thing of respect. I think we have to be humble about our own privilege. If we can be humble about our own privilege, then we can be a lot more accepting about those who haven't had the same privileges.
Yeah. And I think also, like, just to continue on, or to even like go back, you know, a few minutes when you talked about support, and as you were talking about, you know, their need of support and seeing, you know, not looking at assessing parenting capabilities, but really looking at what kind of services they might require. I know that in my brain, I could think of a whole bunch of people who would make the argument, well, see, she's saying that they need help. And so if they need help, that means they can't do it on their own. And so they can't parent, and sort of have sort of that, you know, line of train of thoughts that lead to sort of that conclusion that because they need support, then they can't parent. What would you say to someone who would argue that to you in terms of, you know, making that assumption that needing support means you're incapable?
Well, often that is the, often that is the reason why permanent care orders are made. They'll say, because this parent will need support forever, and often you'll have assessors who'll go, without 24/7 support, we couldn't leave this parent 1 minute with this child without the child being in danger, is basically what they're saying. And that's going to be lifelong. So even at the age of 17, they'll still need someone there beside them when they're ever with this child. Is like, when you actually sit down and actually unpack that throwaway comment, how bizarre that is. And when you sort of think about it, nobody parents independently. Nobody parenting, and particularly decision making around parenting, is something that is a shared endeavour. In most, in your sort of ableist, normal, middle class, Western notions of the the two-parent, family, the nuclear family, it's, mother and father making decisions. When the father's not around, we see it as, well, that's the role of the mother. At the end of the day, it's the role of the mother. But the reality is that we go to a lot of people to help us with decision making around our parenting. We look to a lot of people for support. And it's quite interesting that, hopefully people, listening to this podcast who are maybe, new parents themselves or have younger children, just to think back to the time when, you had your children, and the number of people who offered support in terms of, well, if you want a night off, we'll come over and babysit the baby, or why don't I hold the baby for a while you go and have a sleep? I'll mind the pram while you go in and get that. All of those things that we just take for granted. But for these parents, if they were to ask for it, have to reach out and ask for it, it's like, well, see, they can't do it. Because we're always looking for things to show that they can't do it because we believe they can't do it. And in terms of those services, lots of people outsource parts of their parenting. It's a good thing that we outsource parts of our parenting, because it opens our children up to sort of their social world and their socialization. So, one of the ironies, I often tell this story, is I remember being in a child protection case conference, and we were trying to get more childcare for the child who was about 3 or 4, and I was advocating that the child go into childcare 5 days a week, and the child protection worker was, her comment to this was, well, when are the parents going to be parenting if that's happening? And I was saying, well, it's going to provide that child with structure 5 days a week. It takes some of the pressure off the parents so that they can, focus on the other things that we want them to focus on. It's, it's a win-win for both. And she goes, yeah, but when will they be parenting? And so the conversation went on, and then it came to, it was nearing the end of the business day, 5 o'clock here. And the meeting had gone a little bit overtime. She goes, look, I'm going to have to wrap this meeting up. I've got to go and pick my kids up from daycare. And I said, did you hear what you just said? And she goes, yeah, I just said that I have to go and pick my kids up. And I said, and she just didn't even see the double standard in that. Yeah. So I think if we really listen to ourselves sometimes, and I think that's the thing that gets me, just listen to it. Listen to yourself sometimes when you say stuff. Yeah. And be critically reflective. I think that's I think there's the assumptions that are there are so entrenched in our society, so uncritiqued, that we take them on board and we operate out of them. I don't think that, you know, that child protection worker wasn't a bad child protection worker. In fact, I believe that, you know, child protection workers have an incredible job to do and a really important job to do, and I totally support them. But, you know, I think it's also a position where it does require a lot of critical reflection to work in this space. I think the other thing that gets really muddled here is it becomes, particularly in the child protection space, it seems that if you say that if you start to talk about parents with intellectual disabilities, then, you know, it's, well, what about the children?
Mm-hmm.
And it's sort of like, well, you're on about the parents, we're on about the child. And this sort of dividing the family up this way it's really very unhelpful. You know, if you look at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, you know, one of the foundational, if you actually read the preamble of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it talks about the family as being the foundational unit of society. You know, I think it's Article 8 that says, you know, that a child has a right to be with their family of origin, unless, of course, that's not possible. And then you swap over to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, to Article 23, and the same is said from the position of, you know, parents have a right to be able to rear their children and to receive the support from the state that they require, unless, of course, that puts a child in danger. So it's very clear what our first port of call needs to be. Our first port of call isn't removal of children, but that's what we focus on. We focus on the danger as opposed to, well, what is our responsibilities in terms of support, which gets back to what I was saying before.
So let's talk about support. I mean, we've been pretty much talking about that, but two of the articles also that you provided talked about sort of those practices that support parenting, and in terms of also specialist advocacy. So do you want to sort of focus a little bit on that and describe what those are and might be?
Yeah, I think also we tend to see part of our pessimism or part of our hesitancy about supporting parents with intellectual disabilities is we see it as, oh my God, they would need so much. Whereas really the support that the vast majority of parents with intellectual disabilities need is really sort of not much more than what would be in a well-resourced family, you know. And the other thing that we fail to think about is that parenting is developmental. And so, you know, you build on support. So support actually creates, you know, sort of, you support on one thing, people learn from those things, they build up a parenting repertoire. And, you know, I don't think that we actually think about that, because we don't think about people with intellectual disabilities as being able to learn. Whereas we have now, you know, 7 decades of research that actually says, you know, if approached the right way, in terms of responding to a person's learning style in the appropriate way, parents with intellectual disabilities can learn. And, you know, they are lifelong learners like the rest of us, but people don't believe that. So they actually think that there's something, it's sort of a bit like they've got no memory, so you'll always be doing the same thing, which is once again bizarre in terms of why people think that. What they also forget is they forget the agency of children in this, even young babies. We're biologically adapted to cue our caregivers in. And so, you know, the other thing is that parents and children learn together at how to negotiate things. and you know, children. So, you know, we fail to see, you know, sort of where we fail to take that into account often in terms of when we're thinking about support. We also tend to think about support only in terms of what we as paid workers can provide. And we see it in terms of dollar terms rather than, and in terms of like sort of things that formal services provide. Whereas I think for the families that I've known that, that have succeeded, it's really about giving them the opportunities to build circles of support around themselves, and you know, and for workers to be sort of looking out for opportunities to enable that community participation, and to allow those things that happen in every family's life, which is, you know, sort of to develop, you know, sort of communities of support and be part of communities of support. You know, we tend to think about the parents in terms of, you know, just us and the service and the task. I think also, you know, one of the things is people often say parents with intellectual disabilities are not good at learning, or they can't learn. And my argument is we're not good at teaching them. I think, you know, I don't think it is that, you know, I've worked with persons with cognitive disabilities for over 40 years, and they surprise me in what they know and can learn and how they go about learning. I think that's the thing that I find so exciting about working in this sphere, is they never fail to surprise me in terms of, particularly when they're motivated with something and understand the importance of something, how ingenious they are at getting around, you know, sort of their cognitive differences, and how they make do. And I think as workers we fail to see that. I think as workers, yeah, as I say, we've got sort of, it's like we've got one tune and we don't know how to, we've got one teaching tune and that's all we play, rather than sort of thinking about how we can actually improvise and adapt our tune, our educational tunes around parenting. So I would say, you know, a lot of it has to do with that that by and large, you know, we're not good at adapting and improvising our educational methods in parenting. And I think some of that is because also around parent education and in all the areas of community care, it's not valued. It's feminized work. It's not valued, and the bean counters, those that are sort of deciding to see, oh, anyone can go in and do that job. Anyone could go in and help that family get a routine going in the morning. Anybody could go in the afternoon to make sure that the kids are sort of a bath. Anyone can do that. Anyone can't do that. It requires a lot of skill to often do the most, what can seemingly be very simple tasks. Mm-hmm. And I think until, you know, sort of we actually own that and value that, I see that we throw I can see a lot of waste of money. And I see, you know, we throw sort of money at things in, it's sort of like going off and buying sort of disposable things or cheap things, and they break down and you just replace them. It's sort of not economical. Mm-hmm. What we're doing.
Yeah. You're definitely sort of unpacking again, sort of a lot of different things. You know, you mentioned earlier sort of culture. You touched upon sort of this concept of ableism and how we sort of view parenting and how we define it. and also how we define sort of support, you know, and mentioning sort of how we see support as being this, you know, formal thing that must exist, a contract between two people, when support exists in many different ways.
Yeah, we see it as we often treat it as a transactional thing.
Yeah.
Support is transactional, whereas support is often relational.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. So anyways, we could continue, and especially you and I could continue until the wee hours of the night for me, and all day for you. But I'm just going to change gear a little bit and sort of focus more in terms of the future. So within a few sort of minutes, what would you sort of see us needing to do as a community that would be helpful for parents, families, the field? So I'll let you sort of decide where you want to go with this. This is a very large question, but
yeah,
any insight would be great.
Yeah, it's interesting, Marjorie, because I've been looking at, of course, same as in Canada, it's Australia, you know, our First Nations, our record of dealing with First Nations families and is atrocious. And we both have, you know, in terms of child protection, and our First Nation families have been very poorly served and treated. And I'm looking at some of the sort of the trends happening here in Australia around, for example, we've got Aboriginal placement principles. So, you know, sort of basically enshrined now in our Act is, you know, principles around how services should be engaging with First Nations families. I think there's something to be learnt from that in the area of disability. I think I've started to coin the term that we need to become disability informed. We're all very, very aware of being having cultural competence. We also, in terms of trauma, we all need to be trauma informed. Well, my thing is we need to be disability informed as a society. I think there needs to be a lot more work done in terms of talking about disability informed practice. And that disability informed practice needs to really address the social disablement. And I think that's a real start. I think that's something that has to happen. I don't think anything else is going to, I don't think there's going to be major shifts in what's provided until we actually until there's a critical mass of people who are talking about being disability informed practitioners across law, across health, across human services, across education. So we need to have people who are quite willing to say, I'm a disability informed practitioner, just as they're quite willing to say, oh, I'm a trauma informed practitioner. I'm culturally competent. That, you know, that it's something that you would have on your CV, that you're disability informed. Now, I know all of those can be lip service, but I think we need to actually, that needs to be something that needs to be very much part of professional training. Because I think until people start to think differently, they go to those entrenched assumptions. So my first thing would be, there needs to be a focus on across educational programs, vocational programs, and in universities, particularly around disability informed practice. I think we need to be rolling out, I think, sort of much more money in terms of public campaigns around just like public health campaigns around disability awareness. I think, we need to be showing a different face of families. And when we present families where a parent has a disability, we don't present them as being sort of at risk or a danger. We show that how it can happen. And I know that, we haven't talked about today, but we might talk about in another podcast, just about sort of my own involvement as a as a support person to a family with disabilities,
Yeah.
and how we've presented that in the media. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing that's really important, I think that we have to, that while we've got siloed services, I think sectors, I think that's problematic, not only just for parents with intellectual disabilities, but for all people with disabilities. You know, I think that sort of, for example, you know, one of the issues, one of the big issues for families where a parent has an intellectual disability is their environment, so where they're placed. You know, so, you know, they need to be placed, you know, they need to be able to access affordable, safe housing in enriched communities that are disability aware, that are disability friendly. So it's not just about putting a roof over their head in a housing estate, but in the right housing estate, in the right housing, and that people actually consider that. I think that makes all the difference. I think, in fact, you know, if you're strategically, you know, sort of having families placed in areas where, you know, they are around other families that are welcoming, that are inclusive, you know, you're going to cut down in a lot of services that are going to be needed. I think that we also need to be dropping our expectation that this idea of you've got to be able to do everything as a parent, and that you've got to be able to, so our benchmark is that you parent autonomously, I think is, you know, needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
So I think putting in supports, therefore, that, you know, so for example, going back to the childcare thing, that you actually say, of course we would put this child into daycare 5 days a week because it's going to enrich this child, it's going to give this child this socialisation, instead of going, you know, sort of, how come they're getting that over someone else, or, you know, when are they going to be parenting? So that mean-spirited, like, let's think of this child, what are they going to gain by being in this enriched environment? We know things like, you know, Head Start programs in the States, my God, we go back, you know, decades now, knowing that, you know, giving kids a enriched early childhood experience sets them up for life. And so I think particularly with these families, you know, that is just a given, and it shouldn't be something that they should have to feel they have to be stressed about to get. It should be something that they're rewarded for giving their children. So I think those types of things
I
are
think
really
there's
important.
like, yeah, there's like so many different things, and definitely you're tapping into a lot of them. You
So I
know,
think sometimes we think very micro, and we think, oh well, it's about, you know, support workers going in and doing blah 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 blah.
Yep.
But, you know, it's about, you enrich the environment, you provide those opportunities, and trust that parents with, the vast majority of parents with intellectual disability will run with that, and they will do well with that. Of course, there's going to be some that don't, but there's some that's not got to do with intellectual disability. You can, you know, there's going to be other issues, and, you know, people are not always going to succeed. And when they don't succeed, we don't punish them for that. We don't treat them like pariahs. We don't see them as so dangerous to their children that we don't let them see their children, unless of course they are, but that's not going to be because of an intellectual disability. That's, you know, that's got to do with much more complex personality traits. So my thing is, so a lot of it is about, as I said, it's about taking a capabilities approach, and also just at the end of the day, being a bit kind.
yeah.
Oh my God,
Kind.
just being a bit kind.
Yeah. And being,
you know?
able to, you said it earlier, you know, to critically reflect and be able to sort of see each of us as part of the problem and part of the solution. at the same time, you know, and sort of having that, yeah. So I'm going to ask you one last question, and in a few sentences, if there was one recommendation that you could give to childcare workers, or one thing you would like them to know, what would it be? Like
okay, I'm going to borrow two statements that I think people should remember. The one is from my own granddaughters who have grown up with a mum with intellectual disability. And it's the statement of Lily, who says, "Don't judge a book by its cover. We're not a perfect family, but we get through it." The other one I want to borrow is someone who was a wisdom figure for me in this area, and it's Polly Snodgrass, who was part of the Wisconsin group in the 1990s, who did a lot of work around supporting parents with intellectual disabilities. And Polly said, and this has been ingrained on me, our job is not to find better parents for children. Our job is to protect children from unsafe parenting practices. Yeah. And so when you go in, of course, you can look at a child and go, they might look much better in a situation that you're more comfortable with. But our job is not to find better parents. According to our ableist views. Our job is to build the capacity of the parents that they have, to protect them from any unsafe practices. Yeah. And if we start from that premise, we'll be less likely to want to rescue. Kids don't want to be rescued. Kids don't want to be rescued. What they want is they just want their family to be okay. So support kids to make their families okay.
Yeah. And thank you for that. I think those are two definitely beautiful quotes. And, you know, I'm happy to say that both Beth and Lily have, you know, agreed to be on this podcast and to talk to me. So I can't wait for me to have a chat with them. I usually sort of say hi from a distance, but it's going to be certainly a treat for me, and I think a treat for everybody who's listening. So I wanted to thank you so much for your time and for spending and being so gracious upon, you know, your wealth of knowledge and wisdom and your experience and sharing that with us. So thank you so much.